interfere with critical vehicle function.
Welcome to Future Thinking episode 129. My name is Alexander Schotten. This is another English episode featuring an outstanding guest, so stay tuned. If you prefer German episodes, please join me for the next one. The title of today's episode is Rules. The term rules encompasses a variety of concepts including algorithms, maxims, principles, models, laws, regulations, and even laws of nature. In essence, rules shape our world and our lives. My guest for this exciting conversation is Professor Lorraine Daston. Lorraine Daston is Director Emerita at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, a permanent fellow of the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin, and a visiting professor in the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. After studying at Harvard and Cambridge Universities, she taught at Princeton, Harvard, Brandeis, Chicago, and Göttingen Universities before becoming one of the founding directors of the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, serving from 1995 until her retirement in 2019. She has published extensively on topics in the history of science, including probability, wonders, objectivity, and observation. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the Leopoldina National Academy of Germany, and a corresponding member of the British Academy. One of her recent books, titled Rules, the namesake of this episode, will be at the center of our discussion. For our German audience, a German translation of this book is also available. As always, all links and references can be found in the show notes. This episode has another inspiring connection. In episode 120, I spoke with her husband, Professor Gerd Gigerenzer. If you are German speaking, I highly recommend listening to both episodes, as you'll find a number of overlapping and complementary topics and ideas. A few brief remarks about this episode before we dive into the conversation. This podcast is primarily in German, but includes a growing number of exceptional English episodes. You can filter episodes by language on the podcast website. Additionally, this podcast is free of advertisements. If you enjoy this episode, please support the project by sharing it with friends, family, and colleagues, or by posting links on social media. Don't forget to leave a rating, stars, thumbs up, or whatever the system you prefer uses. Enjoy the podcast on Spotify or YouTube, but the best way to listen to it is through your favorite podcast player. Simply search for Zukunft Denken and subscribe to the feed to stay updated with every episode. Unlike fleeting daily news, this podcast delivers timeless insights, making past episodes just as compelling as new ones. If you have any comments, please do not hesitate to write me an email. Now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Professor Lorraine Daston. Professor Daston, thank you very much for Daston. Now I said it wrong again. I joked before that. I joked before that when I read your first book that I thought you would be a French author, but that's obviously wrong. You're an American author, and I'm very grateful that you take time. a friend of mine, Jan, who was also on the podcast several times, recommended one of your books, Objectivity, because I was researching for my own book, and it was really an extraordinary, interesting book. And then I just looked for other books that you've written, and at least one of the other ones is Rules. And I would very much like to talk about rules today, because somehow that fits quite nicely into some other topics that we talked recently, also with your, if I may say so, husband, Gerd Gigerenzer, who I had the privilege to talk with a few months ago. So I think there might be some overlaps here, I suppose.
I would be surprised if there weren't.
Exactly. I also had when I read the book titled Rules, you know what my first thought was? Rules. You know, I'm computer scientist too, no? And I was thinking rules, okay, if this, then that, so book is written, so how much can you write about rules? But of course, that is, there's a lot of surprisingly interesting things to be said about rules. Could you maybe, start with defining what rules are for you, and maybe we can also go into the direction, then there's a lot of, I would say, similar terms, maybe like rules and algorithms and models and laws and regulations. Could we maybe dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, I deliberately cast my nets very wide in the book. That is, I did not restrict myself to any single dictionary definition of the rule, but rather looked at the cluster of terms that we associate with rules or consider to be subspecies of the genus rules. So regulations, laws, maxims, principles, rules of thumb, All of these are, to some extent, variations on the theme of rules. One way of thinking about rules is to think about them along the axis of specificity versus generality. So you might think about, in terms of specificity, very local, very particular rules. For example, who can park on which side of the street at which time on which day? That might be an example of a regulation, which is at the very local, very specific end of the rule spectrum. At the other end, we might take the law of gravitation, which holds, we believe, both in the room where we happen to be and in the most remote galaxy. We believe also that it has probably, with perhaps some reservations on the part of cosmologists who believe that laws of nature evolve, but that it has probably operated in the same fashion for all of time since the Big Bang, since there has been time. And that would be the farthest end of generality for rules. In between those two poles of a spectrum, there are all manner of rules of differing degrees of specificity and generality. We might consider the laws of a country to be edging toward the middle. They certainly aim for a certain generality and permanence. We might think of the law of nations, international law, as edging even more in the direction of generality. But I think you get the idea. Almost any point along that continuum could be occupied by a particular example of a rule.
But then you also make the point throughout the book, as far as I remember, you talk about thick and thin rules. Is this equivalent to what you said now, generality and specificity?
No, it's not. So let me define first what thick and thin rules are, and then explain how it might relate as yet another axis, perhaps perpendicular to specificity and generality. So thin rules are perhaps the ones with which we are most familiar. These are rules which are formulated in a form that does not anticipate exceptions. They are formulated often in considerable detail, not necessarily, but in considerable detail. And their tone is the imperative. They are peremptory. These are the rules. Perhaps the thinnest rules of all we are familiar with are computer algorithms. These are rules. Everyone has had the experience of filling out an online form and realizing that you do not fit any of the available categories because the form, the thin rule, does not admit of more than a certain number of options which have been foreseen on the basis of what is considered to be the normal case. If you fall outside that realm as an exception, you are by definition pathological. A thick rule is a rule which is formulated with examples, observations, and often exceptions. This is a rule which has built-in elasticity. It expects circumstances to be highly variable and unpredictable, for the world to be both heterogeneous and unstable. The thin rule presumes that you will not ever need to exercise judgment in order to apply the rule to a particular case. That's why the computer algorithm has been enlisted, because it does not have judgment. The thick rule tries to prepare you for the fact that you are going to be constantly called upon to exercise judgment about, first, which rule should apply in this case, and secondly, how should you tweak the general rule to apply to the specific case. So those are thick and thin rules. And you might imagine them, if you want to imagine a picture, imagine the thick rule as the Michelin man, composed of tires. So he's upholstered against the shocks of an unstable, unpredictable world. And if you imagine the thin rule, imagine a stick figure, which has no features whatsoever except a kind of set of lines, geometric lines. These rules, you can imagine thick rules which are quite specific. You can imagine, for example, a thick rule which is about how to play a particular game. One of the things I did in the book was to examine game manuals. So manuals that told you the rules of chess and checkers and a great many other games. You might think that there was absolutely no room for maneuver once you've specified the game of chess. But in a very famous 17th century book of rules, you are told all the rules we now observe about chess. So, for example, that if you touch a piece, you must move it, that a bishop is worth more than a knight, and a knight is worth more than a pawn, etc. But you are also told that you must very carefully observe the psychology of your adversary. If you find that your adversary likes to play a lot with the knight, then you should be willing to sacrifice a piece, for example, a bishop, of greater value in order to capture one of your opponent's knights, because it will unsettle him and give you an advantage. That's an example of how what we consider to be now very thin rules, the rules of the game of chess, can be made thick, elasticized. And they can be very specific, as you just saw in that example. But they could also be very general. They could be principles of the form honesty is the best policy. That is a rule which demands judgment every time you apply it. Is honesty the best policy if your colleague asks you whether you liked his newest book, which you found unbelievably boring? Probably not. That example, by the way, comes from Kant, who in this case was willing to relax some of his more rigorous moral strictures in such situations. So the axis of thick and thin rules is orthogonal to the specificity generality one. But they're both ways I try to map the variety of rules.
Well, speaking of Kant, this reminds me to the fact that when Kant wrote the Critique of Pure Reason, to my historic knowledge, a friend of him actually told him that this book is unreadable and terrible, and he should write something that is clearer. And what was the consequence of that was the Prolegomena, which is hardly better readable.
Yeah, he didn't have a way with titles, I must say. Yes, he was a great philosopher, right? Yeah,
exactly. That's interesting. But now to come back to thick and thin rules. Now, what came to my mind is two things actually. One is, would you say that it's a correct assessment to say that our, let's say, modern way of life or human culture in a wider sense is quite dependent on rules that we give us, at least arbitrary rules that we make up, opposed to maybe a lot what happens in the animal kingdom? Number one. Number two, there seems to be sort of a historic change in how we apply rules, because you brought in your book the example of the rule of Saint Benedict, who was, how do you say, a head of a monastery, if I'm not...
right, he was the abbot of a monastery and the
abbot of a monastery.
Of the Benedictine order, yes.
Yeah, and my gut feeling would be, also because we talked of the work of Professor Gigerenzer, that in our modern world is highly unpredictable in many ways, and you would actually accept that we use a lot of thick rules in that sense, so that we are able to sort of navigate these unpredictabilities in a better way. But it seems to me that we use more and more thin rules. So maybe the question would be, when we go from the rule of Saint Benedict, that you can maybe explain to the modern times, how did the development or the evolution of rules change also our society?
Well, first of all, I'm speaking as an historian, and speaking as a historian, especially of a pre-modern period, I can tell you that our lives are immensely more predictable and stable than those of people who lived in the 6th century or the 15th century or even the 18th century. So although I think Gerd is correct to say that the future is always uncertain, and the farther you reach into the future, the more uncertain it gets, it's nothing compared to what it was like living in an earlier period. So that...
Sorry, may I interject here? Because I think this is a very interesting question in itself. Can I ask you if my theory would be right? I would say that the predictability of the life of the pre-modern life was much higher in the mid and long term and much lower in the short term, whereas our contemporary life is much more predictable in the short term and much less predictable in the long term.
Right. So I can see why you say that, and I can see some truth to that, as a matter of fact. So let me give you an example, and you tell me whether this is what you meant. So that, yes, in the short term, if a hailstorm wipes out this year's crop, then famine and dearth reigns throughout the land, and no one could predict that. And it has enormous consequences for everybody. On the other hand, you might say that because sons tended to follow the careers of their fathers, there was more long-term stability. There is indeed some truth to that. There is, however, less truth than we like to think. If you just look at the physical trajectories, not the career trajectories, but the physical trajectories of people, let us say, in the Middle Ages, the European Middle Ages, they traveled astonishing distances. Not everyone, but an astonishing number of people traveled distances that we can barely imagine on donkey, on foot, on horseback. And they encountered things which they could barely imagine had they had stayed in their native villages, especially in times of warfare and plague. You see mass migrations of people, and also times of confessional strife. For example, during the Reformation, you see vast migrations of people having to adapt to entirely new circumstances. Even if you were to take just one life, the life of Johannes Kepler, a good Southern German boy educated at the University of Tübingen, who ends up, for religious reasons and also professional reasons, migrating over Europe, seeking, as a Protestant, refuge from Catholic persecution when he was teaching at Graz, then the court at Prague. He then has to return to his native village to defend his mother from witchcraft. These are not that unusual as trajectories in the 16th and early 17th centuries. So I would say that the long-term stability that we imagine ruled in previous times is something of an exaggeration, just as the uncertainty of our own times compared to other times is also an exaggeration. Let me give you an example. You and I both probably are wearing some kind of, either you are keeping time by your phone or you're wearing a watch. We make appointments with one another that are accurate almost to the minute. If someone does not turn up for an appointment within, let us say, 7 minutes of the allotted time, we begin to worry that something has gone wrong. The sense of what it was like to be late in an earlier period, and in some parts of the world today, might be as long as 2 hours. This gives you some sense of the margin of uncertainty in life in different places at different times. And you can also see what happens when an element of real uncertainty is introduced into modern life. For example, during the pandemic, you will remember that the first thing that people began to tear up were their calendars. Because although we had been used to planning not just 1 week, 3 months, 6 months, often a year in advance, that no longer seemed to make sense in a world in which we did not know from one day to the next how we would be living.
I find this very interesting in itself, because the question, what can we predict, what is predictable, because the thought came to me, I just looked it up now, because there was some years ago a conversation with the philosopher Peter Sloterdijk, and I have to translate it in English roughly because he said it in German, but what he said roughly was, since the antiquity, it was pretty much irrelevant when you were born, because there was practically always the same theater playing, in the sense like the technology didn't change so much, and the culture of how people lived. This was what I meant with the longer time frame. But
Right,
it's about 200 years. This is not true anymore, because we have so...
Right, no, but I do wish philosophers would read some history on this completely inaccurate description of earlier periods.
Interesting. But nonetheless, let's come back to the rules, because you made the example of the rule of St. Benedict, which I think explains the requirement to be able to adapt to change, right? That was or to unpredictable situations.
Yes. Yeah, the rule of St. Benedict is really interesting. It's formulated in the early centuries of the Christian era, 5th and 6th century, and it's still the case that it is the ordering principle for the life of Benedict monasteries all over the world, whether they are in France or in Italy or in Arizona or in the Philippines. All of the monks are in principle following the same order of the day. The 73 chapters or precepts of the rule of St. Benedict order every aspect of the monk's life, what they can wear, when they get up in the morning, when they go to sleep, what they eat. And the rule of St. Benedict refers to the entire set of the 73 chapters. And each of the chapters tells you, for example, that the monks have 3 meals a day, and the main meal of the day is at midday, and they are allowed basically a pound of bread and a hemina, which is about a quarter of a liter of wine, and nothing more, and 2 cooked dishes, and nothing more, nothing less. And this is very typical of the rule of St. Benedict. And the very next sentence, an exception is made. Unless it is summer and the monks have been laboring long hours under the hot sun, then they may be given more to drink. Another of the precepts says, under no circumstances should there be any conversation at meals. The only sound should be the voice of the monk who has been appointed to read the biblical passage of the day. Next sentence, unless there is a guest in the monastery and the abbot, out of politeness, directs the monks to converse with the guest. And all of the rules read like this. They state in no uncertain terms exactly what is to happen. And then in the next sentence, there is an unless, and the abbot is allowed to make an exception under certain circumstances as he sees fit. And it becomes clear that the rule of St. Benedict is the abbot. The abbot is the model of what it means to lead a saintly life in this terrestrial world. He is the model of Jesus Christ in the monastery. And therefore, the rule is not so much the stipulations of those 73 chapters, but the model of conduct set by the abbot himself. And therefore, there's no inconsistency in the abbot making what seem to us like constant exceptions to his rules, because the rule itself is not the articulation of those precepts of when you should go to bed and when you should get up in the morning, but rather the model of the abbot.
I find this very interesting because for me, at least 3 further conclusions or threads derived from these ideas. The one would be, and actually you wrote it in your book as a quotation, you wrote, no rules could be given to oversee when and how rules could be legitimately broken without an infinite regress of rules, meta rules, and so on. So I think the point behind this is more like also a philosophical one. I think you also referred to Wittgenstein, that we actually have a very fundamental problem if we want to define a very clear structure of rules, because we sort of come into an infinite regress. Where should we stop, right? This would be the first question.
Right. It is a Wittgensteinian point. This is Wittgenstein's example, although it's an example he borrows from older sources, in which a teacher is trying to teach a student about mathematical series. And the teacher gives the student a series 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, all the way up to 1,000. And then the teacher asks the student, what comes next? And the student says, not 1,002, but 1,004. And Wittgenstein pauses here and says, the teacher thinks that the student has simply misunderstood or made a mistake. But in fact, you can imagine mathematical series, which proceed by adding increments of 2 up to 1,000, but then at 1,000 start adding increments of 4. This is a well-defined mathematical function. And he uses this example to show that even what seems to us the most straightforward rule, the one which is almost completely bare of any need for interpretation, does require interpretation. And that is the reason why Wittgenstein says we can't simply solve the problem of rule following by adding meta rules of interpretation. This is a procedure which will go on to infinity.
And also, if I would interpret this correctly, it would also be a mute point to try to create, let's say, neutral laws in a nation, in the sense we do not want an individual to have power over others, so we just define neutral rules. But in the end, there is always some exception that someone has to manage individually, right? So you cannot get away from that, no?
Yes, and I think that's why people are so very frustrated with bureaucracies, because the bureaucracies, usually because they wish to avoid the appearance of any unfairness, because the bureaucrats themselves are not legislators, they are bureaucrats, they are not elected officials, they have no legitimacy to make rules, they can only enforce them, so that they strive to enforce them as mechanically as possible and as rigidly as possible. So even when any reasonable human being can see that it's ridiculous to apply the letter of the rule, that one should apply the spirit of the rule to a particular case, the bureaucrat will often refuse to bend the rule. One very amusing example of this is what's in German called the Streik nach Vorschrift. Especially public officials who are forbidden to strike, like customs officials, decide to follow every single rule in the book, which results in enormously long lines because it takes forever to apply all the rules in the book to every case. And this is the case in almost every situation with rules. If at airports, customs officials applied every check in the book if they examined all of our suitcases and all of their contents, people would stop flying immediately. It would be unbearable. This is a graphic example of what happens when people don't use discretion and don't use judgment, but it's always done in a way to deny its own existence, to deny the fact that the rules always have to be adjusted to the particular cases.
That's really fascinating. So the actual attempt to not give bureaucrats power over you actually gives them the power in a hidden way, sort of in a hidden way, and indeed, in a very annoying way on top of that.
Right, exactly. I mean, and this is a general phenomenon of what you might call rule overload, so that if you have too many rules and they are too suffocating and they're too constricting, I think that I don't know what your experience has been, but my experience at the moment has been of what are called in German Brandschutzregelungen. So these are fire protection rules, which are, everybody agrees it's sensible to have fire protection, but they become such an encumbrance that it's almost impossible to do anything. And what happens in that situation is that people stop obeying rules altogether, so that you have a situation of chaos, basically, because to obey all the rules would mean gridlock. Nothing would ever get done. And people do not feel that they have the power or the discretion to decide which rules are reasonable and which not. So they simply ignore all the rules.
That's really super interesting. And maybe come back to that later again. A second aspect to what you said previously was the question to me, how do you actually tell another person how the rules work? Because there are generally two ways to do it. The one would be to give the person like a handbook, let's say the example of chastity brought. I give them a handbook that explains in sort of a legalistic term, if this, then that, and so like, something like that. And the other way would be to teach by example. And my feeling is that this, the second one is probably the one that is more in our nature. Don't you think so?
I think that's true. And that's why I thought it was very important to include the meaning of the rule as model in the book. Even how you learned mathematics. Mathematics is perhaps the most rule-governed enterprise that human beings have yet devised. And yet one learns how to solve problems in algebra, for example, by doing lots and lots of examples. It's by doing lots and lots of examples that you recognize, for example, how you solve two simultaneous equations and two unknowns. You recognize that kind of problem by having done lots and lots of different variants on that kind of problem. And if you look at how small children learn, they do not learn by you giving them a handbook about how to behave. They learn by imitating their elder siblings, their parents, their teachers. Very few rules, with the possible exception of traffic rules, are learned from handbooks.
Which also incidentally brings me to another interesting aspect of the whole story. Chess, again, is a very good example. I think we humans are not really made to internalize formal rules very well, but we are very capable for what I would call pattern matching. And I think that's I bring this example to my students when we talk about complexity and because chess is actually a very easy game in the sense the rules are not very complicated. You can teach chess to everyone who is moderately intelligent within, let's say, 10 minutes. you taught them chess, how to play chess. And then I asked the students, okay, now if you can play chess after 10 minutes, will you beat Magnus Carlsen? Of course you will not. Why? Because he knows the rules much better? No, because he learned over, I don't know, maybe years and decades, sort of a pattern matching, sort of a ability to read, to recognize positions immediately that you exactly have not encoded in clear patterns, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. And I think that studies of chess grandmasters are very interesting. They clearly end up, because for long experience, having a kind of gestalt recognition of these patterns. They don't think of them as parts. They see them as wholes. And it's rather like people, so singers, for example, who know certain, you might call them building blocks of music, so certain patterns, certain sequences of chords, etc. And so when they're memorizing a piece of music, they recognize that module. They don't have to recognize the individual notes anymore. They know this is the module that modulates from C minor to D major or whatever. And that seems to be very typical of human cognition.
Because if this would not be the case, then a chess master couldn't play simultaneously against 20 people.
Right.
Because they probably couldn't really remember like it piece by piece. So it's more like the pattern that they remember, right? And about chess, about music, this brings me also to an anecdotal thing that allegedly a chess musician was asked if he can read and understand the musical theory. And his answer was, not well enough to damage my music. And that sort of would give you anecdote, like the idea that the music is more like the patterns, the things that I've incorporated, not so much the rules that I've written down.
I think that's very typical. It's a wonderful anecdote, and I think it's very typical of how we know when we've mastered something. So, when you first begin to play chess, you are very conscious. Okay, the pawn moves this way, the knight moves this way, the rook moves this way. Or when you're starting to learn a musical instrument, you're very conscious of where your fingers are on the keyboard. But as you get better and better, you become less and less conscious. And it's, I think, typical of the things we do best that we are no longer conscious of doing them. If you were to imagine how you ride a bicycle while you are riding a bicycle, you'd probably fall over.
Again, another funny anecdote that I heard from tennis players. They say, like, the best way to harm your opponent is, let's say you're playing a tennis match and you are not so well because, let's say, the forehand of your opponent is particularly strong this day or something like that, okay? It says the best way to damage your opponent is when you meet him on the net to ask him, why is your forehand so good today?
I see.
And by that, the person gets like, because it's, as you say, a good tennis player is not like thinking I'm making this movement like in a physics book. It's like
fatal, right?
Exactly.
Yes.
And then you start thinking, why is it good? And suddenly you cannot make the shot anymore, sort of, right?
Yeah. And I think that this is, it's not only about, we both gave examples which are of bodily virtuosity, but there are also examples, I think, of intellectual virtuosity, just like the chess players. But also I think mathematicians also recognize modules of proofs after long experience, and and are not conscious of how they do it.
Absolutely, and this is also why gut feeling. I think this is also what Gerd Gigerenzer also mentions. Gut feeling is, I mean, I know it from people who are like, let's say, 10, 20, 30 years in a particular profession. They can be programmers, or they can be plumbers, if you will, or they can be electricians.
Right, yeah.
They often have an intuitive recognition of what the problem is, or what could become a problem, what someone who is maybe well trained but still doesn't have the experience does not.
Yes. I think it's an absolutely general observation. I mean, I have, to give the philosophers their due, I have friends who are philosophers who, when they are listening to a colleague give a lecture, begin to feel uneasy. They feel that there's something wrong with the argument long before they can articulate what is wrong with the argument. They have developed an intuitive feeling for a false logical inference.
And now the third aspect from what you said previously that came to my mind is, of course, rules also, I think, have the aspect of power, right? Because someone is able to define the rules, the other one is not. the other one has to follow the rules. So rules always have also, I would say, some sort of a power structure involved, right? And also someone is making the rules, someone is executing the rules, someone is following the rules. So this is also quite an interesting and important aspect of the whole story, no?
Yes, and those who have power usually have to have some title of legitimacy to that power, which is why in democracies we have such a difficult time with bureaucracies, because in democracy we elect our legislators, we legitimate their authority to make the rules for us, to make the laws for us, but we do not elect the bureaucrats. And therefore, the bureaucrats are in the very uncomfortable position of having to enforce rules, which gives them power, but to appear not to exercise that power, to appear as much as they can to be simple mechanical enforcers of the rules. That is a very uncomfortable situation. And I think it accounts for a great deal of the friction in democracies between citizens and their governments.
And then there's also another aspect. I think you even mentioned it to a certain extent in the book, if I remember correctly. I read a very interesting book of another historian, Thomas Bauer. I don't know if you know him.
Yes, yeah.
You know, and this book is about, in German, Ambiguitätstoleranz. So you would call it like the tolerance for ambiguity. I think you would probably, please correct me if my English terms are wrong. Yeah,
No, but, perfect. Yeah.
So I hope I'm not distorting his work too much, but I think that the point he's trying to make is that in our recent years or decades, maybe lost a little bit our capability to handle ambiguity and want to write down and nail down everything in details. And this leads to heavy-handed interventions. And also, of course, when you want to avoid ambiguity, then by definition, you also say there is only this and that. There's nothing in between. Because if there would be something in between, then you would have ambiguity and maybe we cannot handle it anymore. I don't know if you read this book and what is your opinion about the ambiguity?
Yeah, no, I haven't, but I certainly will. It sounds really interesting. I think ambiguity, uncertainty, unpredictability, this is a family of words. And it's very interesting that all of them demand some degree of judgment and discretion. So I think the real problem is that, well, it's a twofold problem. One is a problem of trust. Why do we insist that bureaucrats apply the rules rigidly in exactly the same way to all cases, even though we know perfectly well that all cases are not identical? It's because we do not trust the bureaucrats to use their discretion. We understand discretion as a form of illegitimate power, even though a moment's thought makes us recognize that they must exercise discretion, or the whole, as we said before, the whole system would freeze in gridlock. So that's one problem. It's a problem of trust. The other problem is a craving for certainty. It's very interesting that as in certain societies, the degree of being able to predict our lives and control our lives has grown at an extraordinary pace. We live in one of those islands of order that make it possible, for example, to have a bus schedule which is actually accurate. The bus actually comes when it is supposed to come to the minute. We expect, well, I guess we can no longer expect the Deutsche Bahn to be punctual, but we used to expect the Deutsche Bahn to be punctual.
The Swiss Bahn, the Schweizer Bahn, you could expect.
The Schweizer Bahn ist immer pünktlich. But these are degrees of predictability and control, which in many other parts of the world are simply unimaginable, and in different other periods were unimaginable. Somehow, having more of such predictability creates an appetite for even more, for a desire to control even more aspects of life. This is the case, for example, now with not only knowing the gender of one's baby, but perhaps controlling the gender of one's baby. A degree of control over one's life, which in previous ages would not only have been impossible, but considered unethical. So there's something really quite strange going on here about this voracious appetite for control and predictability, and certainty. The more you have, the more you want. People are never sated with it.
If I would like to add one quotation from Thomas Bauer, because I think it goes beyond certainty. Let me just give you this very brief quotation. In German, it's nur dann, wenn etwas rein ist, kann es eindeutig sein. So translation would probably be only
if it's pure, can it be unambiguous?
Then it can be unambiguous. So we probably are striving for purity. And as soon as you strive for purity, I'm afraid you also start, and this is what frightens me actually, people who want purity generally also make a moralistic argument in the sense, I have the purity because I know what it is. And if I'm not arguing with you, I'm not arguing with you about, I don't know, our perspective of a problem, but I'm morally pure and you're immoral. And now our discussion is over.
Yes, no, it definitely leads to dogmatism. I mean, if you have no tolerance for ambiguity and no tolerance for the possibility that you might be wrong, that's the end of all civil discussion.
And this also leads me to another example that you had in your book. I think my French is so bad. I think it goes back to François-Jacques Guyot, I think was the name. And I think you also brought other examples, like the strange situation that if bureaucracies or let's say power structures, I very well know it from company structures. What you see in companies or organizations like universities is, in my opinion, especially when you have rather incompetent people on the top, is that they see a problem. And what is the immediate reaction? We need another rule. We are not contemplating how could we solve the problem in a fundamental way. No, we need another rule. And suddenly you have more and more rules, but this doesn't necessarily lead to a better outcome. And even if the outcome is not working, more rules, right? I mean, I think you brought a similar example with this Guyot person from, I think, the 19th century or 18th century, maybe.
The 18th century. 18th century. He was an 18th century French policeman, right? Yeah. Right. So Guyot was actually rather high up in the Parisian police force, and he wrote a treatise on policing the city of Paris. And he had fantasies which were actually eventually realized, namely that there would be house numbers on all the houses of Paris, so you could find people, and there would also be, each staircase would be numbered, each door would be numbered, there would be license plates for the carriages, and the police would have enormous files on all of the citizens. And he imagined a huge wheel which would allow the bureaucrats at the Parisian Hôtel de Ville to find the files of every citizen. It's a kind of very oppressive vision of total surveillance and control on the part of the Parisian police. And of course, as I say, a total fantasy. I mean, maybe house numbers have been achieved in Paris, but certainly not this grand wheel of dossiers of every citizen and every citizen's movements. But I think the more general point that you're making is, I think, true to everyone's experience. And I must say, it's been my good fortune in some scholarly institutions where there have been enlightened administrators who have blocked that impulse yet one more rule. So it always happens in every institution that somebody does something which no one could have imagined, and therefore people are indignant and they say, we must do something about this, we must make a rule. It's very difficult to resist this because the indignation is ardent. But the really enlightened administrator says, no, what we've got to do is to get people to internalize the principle behind the rule. And we also have to model good behavior. And this is so much more effective than adding yet another rule, because it's very much like the Wittgenstein example. You get yourself into an infinite regress. It's also like the tax code. There's no tax code which does not have loopholes. And the more you try to close the loopholes, the more loopholes you create. So it's much better to have a system which has very few rules, and that the rules are formulated as general principles, and it's left to the judgment and discretion of the individuals within the institution to try to apply the principles to each individual case. This would mean, of course, being honest about the need for discretion and judgment.
I couldn't agree more, but I have the feeling it's like a universal reaction. Like you see, for instance, we had a terrible terror incident at a school in Graz like some weeks ago. Every time we have something like this, what is the reaction of the politicians? We have to do something, and something means we have to make new rules. But hardly ever is the outcome exactly what you said. So, okay, how can we internalize some general principles? How can we do general principles and not make a case-by-case basis that then makes everything unwieldy and in the end has the opposite effect? And by the way, about Guyot, what I found very interesting is, because I didn't know that, so he envisioned actually a system of total governmental or bureaucratic control over people. Well, the good luck for the 18th century was that they didn't have the technology to do it, but unfortunately now we have the technology to do it. Because now we can actually monitor everyone and do what Guyot probably intended.
Yes, unfortunately, this is true. I mean, it's a frightening possibility, and concerns about privacy are justifiably acute at the moment.
Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we make rules because we want to achieve a particular type of order. And there was, unfortunately, he died recently, the English philosopher Roger Scruton, and in one of his books, he asks the question, what comes first, rules or order? And maybe let me just give you this brief quotation. He says, we should always remember that legislation does not create the legal order, but presupposes it. So I think he makes the point, I would interpret it like that rules or legislation only really works if you have the order sort of already emanating out of the organization, out of the structure, and then it might work to create rules. But if you make rules to inflict order on people that they do not want, that they don't have internalized, then the rules will fail. How do you see this relation between rules and order?
I agree with Scruton that the precondition for the rules is not only an order, but an order which is recognized to be a legitimate order. And conversely, if you have someone making, let us say, an autocratic ruler making rules, it automatically begins to undermine the legislative order. You see this in the United States at the moment with Trump, who is governing by executive order, and Congress, the legislature, has become more and more irrelevant as a result. So the order, the legitimacy of the order is crumbling because he has circumvented its source of legitimacy.
And maybe we could also step back a little bit to a more systemic point of view that I also discussed in other of my episodes, for instance, with your husband, about with Johan Norberg, and also stuff I wrote, for instance, from Thomas Sowell. Your husband, for instance, said more and more detailed regulations are often self-defeating. I think this is pretty much what you also mentioned.
Yeah. No, I remember Gerd confronted with the Gebrauchshinweise of our car, which is as big as an engineering dissertation. And the chance that he was going to read through all of that and master it was very slight.
And maybe I would like to drop two more quotations from previous episodes. One is from Johan Norberg, who said, the more complex a society, the less it can be organized. The more complex society gets, the more simple rules we need. I think this goes also along that line. Would you agree with that?
That's a really interesting idea. I mean, historically, I would say, but I don't mean this normatively, I mean it just descriptively, that, for example, as cities grow larger and larger, denser and denser, there's a tendency for rules to proliferate, for there to be more rules, because there's a sense, for example, you can imagine what traffic would be like in a very large city if there were no traffic lights, there were no rules to govern the interactions of the drivers and the pedestrians and the cyclists. So there's an argument to say that as there are more and more interactions because of the density of the settlement, the more rules you need. But I think it would be an extremely interesting experiment. And there are some Dutch cities which are experimenting with this to have a few simple rules. So, for example, they have taken out all the stoplights, all the stop signs. They no longer have bicycle lanes, and people just have to watch out for each other. The initial results of these experiments, although I find them terrifying, have been, in fact, very positive. There have been fewer accidents. I don't know what the long-term results will be. It really depends on the ability of people to internalize the simple rules and to develop very fine skills of judgment. In the short term, you can imagine that people are very attentive because they're very anxious about causing an accident. Whether in the middle and long term they're as attentive is an empirical question. We'll have to wait for the results of this experiment.
For me, there's a very systemic question here. When you have a highly complex organization, society, whatever you want, you have a problem that Hayek described 70 years ago, or also Thomas Sowell, I don't know if you know him, he's an American economist.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And he made, I think, a very good point. That quotation would be, it's much easier to concentrate power than knowledge. And I think this is, if you will, an opinion that goes very much back to Hayek, in the sense, when you have a various expertise in a society, expertise in society is very distributed, especially in a complex society, because on the top, it's very hard to know all the details that are required to run the society, because the knowledge how to run the society is very distributed, in fact. And if you think you can create a top-down structure, you will sort of, from a systemic point of view, rather by definition fail.
Yes, this was Hayek's argument against socialist planning. His worry that the wartime regimes, he was then in Britain, that the wartime regimes of centralized planning would be continued in peacetime, and wanted to argue that those would be fatal.
Maybe just to slowly close our conversation, there are two aspects I would like to ask you. One is, you mentioned the laws of nature. Now, laws of nature seem to be something very different, no, than what we talked about today, and still we name it in the same way, no?
Yes, and that's exactly the reason for including them. That is, the reason why laws of nature are very different from the rules we've been talking about today is that, first of all, obeying them is not voluntary. You do not have a choice as to whether you obey the law of gravitation. You may choose to cross the street against the light. That's your choice, but you can't do that with the law of gravitation. And the second is related to the first, is they do not have any exceptions. They are universal and they have no exceptions. So everything we've been talking about with rules doesn't apply to them. So why are they called laws? There's no necessity for calling these regularities of nature laws. Other words could have been chosen. There were other words in existence. For instance, Newton calls them sometimes theorems or axiomata. You could borrow words from geometry or other parts of mathematics to describe them. No, they're called laws because in the imagination of the 17th century natural philosophers, they were the laws ordained by God, Deus legislator. This went along. All of these great names in the history of science in the 17th century, Descartes, Newton, Boyle, are Leibniz is here the great good exception, but they all think that basically God ordains the laws of the universe. God is to the universe what the absolute monarch is to the kingdom. And therefore, that is why they are called the laws of nature, even though we all feel that there's something rather inappropriate about that metaphor.
Why though, I have to ask you that, why though was Leibniz, you mean with his monadology, so how was Leibniz here an exception?
Descartes, Boyle, Newton are all what are called theological voluntarists. They believed that God could change his mind about these laws anytime he wished. Leibniz, who was trained as a lawyer, said, no, he can't. Once he has ordained these laws, they are the best of all possible laws. And therefore, it is part of his divine nature to be consistent and to conserve these laws. That's why also Leibniz was very interested in conservation laws, as opposed to laws of force in the Newtonian formulation, because he saw these as the template for divine laws, which are conservation laws. So Leibniz said, no, he can't change his mind, and he won't change his mind.
One point, or maybe a lighter note, but I still find it actually super interesting the more I think about it. We mentioned it partly right in the conversation, but I think it justifies to come back to it. Yesterday, when I was on a walk, I was thinking about our conversation, and what came to my mind was culture and entertainment, if you will. And I find it actually quite interesting that we humans love rules even in our entertainment, in our cultural undertakings. Let me give you 3 examples. Games, music, sport. There is no game without rules. You cannot have 10 people on the field and say, now play. Yeah, but what? What are we playing? So there's always football, tennis, all of them has very clear and very distinct rules. Or sport, so games, the same thing, board games, chess, whatever, but also music. I mean, think of, I'm not a musical theorist, but like think of how's it called, our musical structure. You could make, let's say, a fretless guitar could make any frequency that you would want to, but nonetheless, we have distinct, how do you call it, harmony, like
right,
like
the
our
tones, right?
the tones, exactly. So, but they are not given by nature. There are other Indian and whatnot. There are other harmonies, but still, we make a structure, we make rules, and then suddenly within the rules, the creativity happens. No, is it not somehow surprising or funny?
I think it's a really deep observation. It returning to the theme of music, it's very much the idea of theme and variations. The idea that our most interesting and satisfying and pleasing creations are creations within a certain structure. One example would be jazz improvisation. So jazz is not without rules. There are themes that you can recognize. We have enormous pleasure in the transformation of those themes in ways which are unpredictable. Or comedy. Comedy depends on a violation of rules that we all know, a betrayal
you have cultural
expectations.
ideas, and then you make a transgression of the idea, and this is then the comedy,
That's right,
no?
exactly, right, yes. So you've got to, this is why comedy is so culturally specific, because if you don't know the cultural rules, then you will not find it funny. and of course, sport, the rules are the precondition for being a virtuoso, for showing your prowess on the pitch, on the football pitch. So yes, no, I think that's a really deep observation, and it says something about human nature, which is that much as we complain about rules, much as we feel stifled by rules, we nonetheless crave them. We couldn't live without them. And one way of thinking about a definition of culture is that culture and rules are the same things.
There is this odd quotation about creativity. I cannot entirely replicate it, but it goes somewhere along the line. At the time of the Borgias, like when there was strict rules and dictatorial regimes, the consequence was the Renaissance and all of the following. And in 700 years of Swiss democracy, what they invented was the cuckoo clock. I mean, it's a bit of a.
I think that might have been Karl Kraus. It sounds like Karl.
Yeah, maybe
Kraus.
Something like that. I mean,
That's right,
it's not entirely serious, but there seems to be some sort of that.
I wish to point out that Albert Einstein was a patent clerk in Bern when he came up with this theory of special relativity. That is not a cuckoo clock. So,
yeah. True.
On the side of the Swiss, okay.
True. No, I mean, this was not to be taken entirely seriously, but I think that the serious kernel here is that it seems to be that sometimes rules trigger creativity.
Oh yeah, and I think it'd be very hard so another way of thinking about rules, and this is more rules as models, is to think of genres, for example. So we have the genre of the novel, we have the genre of the sonnet, we have the genre of the epic, we have the genre of the landscape painting, we have the genre of painting period or historical painting. It's within those structures, there's very loose rules, models, that both emulation and invention take place. Something which is entirely without precedent and without any kind of reference to a previously existing genre often just appears chaotic to us. We can't even recognize it as a form of art.
Maybe as a conclusion, if you take let's say a peek into the future, I mean, do you have the feeling that, because at the moment it at least feels to me that we suffocate ourselves by red tape and by over-regulating everything, do you have the feeling that we get this under control again? Or maybe even on a more principled question, when you read, for instance, what John Stuart Mill wrote about liberty in the 1850s, and which I think was one of the foundations of our modern societies. And you could ask the question if individual freedom is even possible, if whenever I make a step, I'm crossing a legal boundary, which I'm not even aware of because there are so many. Does it not stifle our development and our individual freedom? Are you optimistic, or what should we do? I don't know, something in that direction.
I think that there are grounds for hope. I think the observation that too many rules are self-defeating will eventually force changes. And I think the changes probably have to come in a shift from what is now called accountability back to responsibility. So accountability was a concept that came in the 1990s, initially with business firms. It was called the new management. And the idea was that we shouldn't let people evaluate themselves because they will not be impartial. Instead, we will have benchmarks. We will have quantifiable benchmarks, and it will then be able to measure their performance. The problem was that this freed people from taking responsibility for their work. Instead, after they checked all the benchmarks and something still went wrong, they said, well, I've checked all the benchmarks. And we see this with our politicians as well. They say, well, I've done everything that should have been done, and something wrong still happened. We previously had a regime of responsibility. I do not think it is hopeless to return to a regime of responsibility. So I do think there are grounds for hope.
I think this is a very, very good ending of a conversation, from accountability to responsibility. I think that's probably exactly what we should aim for.
I hope so.
Professor Daston, thank you so much for taking time for this conversation. It was really a pleasure. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you.